keys to houses that no longer stand. This is how the Palestinian story begins, and how it is still told, through the heavy iron keys that grandparents pass down to their grandchildren, keys that no longer fit any lock. These are not just objects, but symbols of belonging, the last tangible link to homes left behind in 1948. Families fled with nothing more than a few bundles, their children, and the expectation that this exile would be temporary. They believed they would return in days or weeks. Instead, decades have stretched into lifetimes, and the keys remain, cold reminders of doors that will never open. The year 1948 was a birth for one people, and a catastrophe for another. For Jews, the State of Israel marked the end of 2,000 years of dispersion, the covenant of survival renewed. For Palestinians, the same moment was the Nakba, the catastrophe. In the chaos of war, in the wake of fear and military conquest, over 700,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their villages. Entire towns were emptied, hundreds of villages destroyed. Some fled after hearing of massacres like Deir Yassin, where the killing of civilians spread terror through neighboring communities. Some were driven out at gunpoint. Others left believing they would be able to return when the fighting ended. But the fighting ended without their return. And the new state rose upon the ruins of their absence. The Nakba was not only a loss of homes, it was a rupture of identity. Palestinians became refugees overnight. In the camps of Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, in the crowded quarters of Gaza and the West Bank, life was lived in tents that gradually became concrete. Generations were born into refugeehood, growing up with stories of olive groves and wells they had never seen, but which shaped their sense of self. Refugee camps became more than shelters. They became cities of memory. Children played in alleyways named after the villages their families had lost. Their identities carried not in land, but in the stories and the keys that survived. Then came 1967. In 6 days of war, Israel occupied the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. For Palestinians, the Nakba deepened. New displacements occurred, and those who remained found themselves under military occupation. Land confiscations, checkpoints, curfews, and settlements became the daily rhythm of life. Even those still living in their ancestral villages felt a kind of exile, exiled within their own homeland, unable to move freely, unable to claim full sovereignty. Dispossession created an archetype that is as much spiritual as it is political. If the Jewish story is one of exile and return, the Palestinian story is one of dispossession and longing. One people returned to their homeland to end exile, while another entered exile as a result. And so the archetype of exile doubled itself, mirrored across two peoples living in the same land, each carrying the memory of displacement. Palestinian identity has been shaped by this memory of absence. To be Palestinian is to remember orchards you never walked in, to long for houses you never entered, to keep alive the memory of a village you only know through your grandparents' stories. The loss becomes an inheritance, the Nakba a wound transmitted across generations. The key on the wall becomes not just a reminder of what was lost, but a testimony. We were here, we belong, we have not forgotten. Yet alongside this memory is invisibility. For decades, the world often ignored the Palestinian story, focusing on state building, wars between armies, or geopolitical rivalries. Palestinians were reduced to refugees, their suffering treated as an unfortunate side effect of history. To be Palestinian was not only to lose land, but to lose recognition, to feel erased from the stage of history. And invisibility deepened the wound, making the struggle not just for land, but for dignity, for the right to be seen and remembered. The archetype of exile mirrored here is a haunting one. Jews carried exile for centuries, praying for return, never letting go of Zion. Palestinians now carry the same archetype, longing for their lost villages, dreaming of return. Both peoples inhabit the same spiritual wound, each believing their survival depends on exclusive belonging to the land. And yet, instead of recognizing the shared pattern, they see only rivalry, each convinced that the presence of the other denies their own legitimacy. This mirroring is the tragedy. One exile's healing became another exile's birth. The Jewish vow of never again meant refuge and sovereignty, but for Palestinians it meant displacement and statelessness.
For one, Israel became the fulfillment of prophecy. For the other, it became the symbol of catastrophe. Two truths exist side by side, each valid, each heavy, and yet often denied by the other.
For Palestinians, the Nakba did not end in 1948. It is experienced as ongoing. Every home demolished in the West Bank, every confiscated field, every expansion of a settlement is felt as a continuation of the catastrophe.
The refugee camps still stand, 75 years later, filled with descendants of those first exiles. Each new generation is born into the inheritance of dispossession, carrying the keys, the stories, the longing. This is why Palestinians speak of the ongoing Nakba, not as history, but as lived reality. And yet, within this pain is a resilience. Palestinians call it sumud, steadfastness. It is the refusal to disappear, the determination to hold on to memory, to dignity, to identity, even when the world looks away. It is children in refugee camps studying by candlelight, families replanting trees after bulldozers uproot them, artists and poets giving voice to the invisible. Sumud is resistance not only against occupation, but against erasure. It is the spiritual strength to remain present even when denied. The Palestinian story, like the Jewish story, is a testimony to survival. But survival alone does not heal. To live perpetually in exile, to live always in resistance, is to live with wounds that deepen generation after generation. The archetype of exile risks becoming an identity of permanent loss. And yet, within archetypes lie the seeds of transformation. What was once only dispossession could become a source of shared recognition, if it were seen not as a threat, but as a mirror. Keys to houses that no longer stand. They are not only symbols of loss, they are also symbols of hope, of faith that what was lost is not forgotten. They testify that memory can endure even when walls crumble. But memory alone is not enough. For healing to come, memory must be recognized.
One exile's story cannot cancel another. One people's survival cannot depend on another's disappearance. The Palestinian exile is the mirror of the Jewish exile. Both are true. Both are real. Both are carried in the blood and bones of generations.
The tragedy is not that these stories exist side by side, but that they are seen as mutually exclusive. What if they were seen as complementary, as two halves of the same human archetype of exile and return? What if recognition itself became the first step of return, not only to the land, but to dignity, to visibility, to peace? When one exile was healed, another exile was born. That is the wound of 1948. But wounds can be transformed. The choice before humanity is whether to continue repeating the archetype of dispossession, or to see in the mirror the possibility of twin recognition. For when both exiles are acknowledged, perhaps a new story can emerge, not one of rivalry, but of shared belonging.